Welcome back, nonprofit leaders. I was just saying it's Friday afternoon and rounding out the week. But before we do, we're going to get started on a conversation we haven't talked a little bit about, although we've hinted quite a lot about on some conversations. We're going to be talking about your board. We're going to be talking about nonprofit boards, some of the myths, truths, and how to build a board that actually works. And I've participated in boards as a board member. I've worked under boards and their leadership as a person that's worked for a nonprofit. And I work with them all the time in the work at the charity CFO. So I'm really passionate about this topic. I'm really excited to have a conversation. But as usual, I'm not doing this solo. I brought along my new friend, Katerina Manoff. Katerina, you are a founder. I love having conversations with fellow founders, but you are a founder of a nonprofit, right? And it's a pretty big nonprofit that you have been able to grow really quickly, which boards can be a blessing or a curse in that way. And you're going to share some of your insights and things that you've learned about what works and doesn't work with board leadership. So I'm really excited to talk with you, hear your perspective and how you've been able to organize your board in a way that served your organization and didn't serve as a hindrance in that way. So before we dive right into the conversation that we're eager to have, thank you for taking time out of your very busy day and share some of these tips with other people that are probably desperate for some solutions in this area.
Thank you for having me. I'm always so excited to talk boards. It's something I've spent a lot of time working on, thinking about over the past 5 years running my organization ENGin. So I'm happy to dive in and share what I've learned.
All right, well, let's just dive straight away into it. You said you're a founder, you started this organization, and those that are listening are probably at some variation of either they're a founder starting and struggling with this themselves, or maybe they've inherited a board, right, for an organization that's been around for a while. Tell me, what are the biggest myths about nonprofit boards that you wish more founders and CEOs would have learned or unlearned early on in the process?
So this is actually, I think, why this topic is so fascinating for me because I feel like there's a huge gap between what we hear about boards,
Mm,
whether we're reading books, looking online and webinars, talking to others. We form this idea as founders, especially for me, I was new to the nonprofit industry. So I had no idea. I mean, I knew I needed a board. It was a legal IRS requirement.
right?
And as I set out to build one, I got this story of like a board is this supportive set of resources that are cheering you on, bringing in money for your organization. They're there to help you, and they do all of this for free. And I guess it's great. Sign me up, right?
Right.
Um, as you might imagine, when I started building my board, it didn't look like that, right? I didn't have access to, 5, 10 people who were willing and able to basically work for free, bringing in money and cheering me on and doing what I wanted to do.
Right.
And I immediately went to like, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with ENGin? What's wrong with these
Mm.
board members that they don't know what's going on? And I think it took me years of candid conversations with other nonprofit leaders, both founders and those who came into established organizations, to realize that that ideal is a very, very rare. I mean, it happens, it's definitely out there, but it's sort of like, if you have a kid and there's a mom that has a kid that sleeps through the night, and
Hmm.
3 weeks and going around saying, well, this is what baby sleep looks like. And I've been there, hearing this. It's like, that's not how, I mean, it works like that for a few people, but that's not how it is for the vast majority of us. So why are you going to push this, yeah, this
Mm.
false narrative and make us all feel bad, right? I felt like a very deja vu with that when I was building my board. And fortunately, over time, I realized there was nothing wrong with me or my organization or these potential and actual board members. It's just that the board structure itself is really challenging as far as how
Mm.
it's designed and the expectations put on people, right? So in reality, I feel like there's for most organizations this constant tension between getting the board involved enough, but also not over involved when they're sort of meddling and making things worse. And it's a constant striving towards that balance, and it's slowly building it out year after year
Hmm.
with plenty of mistakes along the way until you get to something that usually is still quite imperfect, but is balanced between that that level of passivity which you do not want and that over involvement which you don't want either. So
Hmm.
I'm hoping that we can tell that story more often because that's actually the reality most of us face, and I think we should be open about, well, this is what boards actually look like. This is what the experience actually is.
Yeah, I love that you uh, said that, like just not being too passive, but not being overly involved in the assumption that we think because we're really passionate about this cause, and even if we have people in our circle and our family and our friends, I think there's this false idea that they should also see the value of what you're trying to do and reflecting on, well, if they're not as excited or bought in or engaged as I had hoped that they would be, what is wrong with me or what I'm doing? I've met so many founders that have really struggled to launch this board because, as you said, it's a legal requirement, and I think every state, the IRS requires you to populate who's going to be on your board with your, your application. And it's a necessary, dare I say, evil in some cases because it's a real distraction for a lot of founders. But I also have found with some founders that they have to settle on their boards or they pull in, people that they know and connect with, and they create what the nonprofit community calls like a founders board. And it feels more of like a yes crew, at least in my experience working with nonprofit leaders that are founders and also trying to pull together this board for a legal requirement, whereas they're not really needing or seeking all of their advice or all of their oversight, maybe parts of it, right? It's a very tricky dynamic. And then I'm really excited to kind of unpack this conversation with you because you've had to scale your organization. So no doubt you've had to reimagine what your board should look like, which kind of brings me to my next question because I'm sure you have to reevaluate, does this person still serve this board or this organization in this way? Or do I need something different on my board now? So kind of my next thought is for founders, especially, or for organizations that are scaling quickly, how should they think about building a board that supports the momentum, the innovation, the moving the organization forward and not being stuck in what was, or maybe what their agenda was? How do you, what advice would you give to those founders?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Tasha, is that because we've grown so quickly, I feel like it's been sort of turbocharged the process of inventing and reinventing my board several times already in the last
Yeah,
5 years, which may sound like a lot of turnover, but I mean, the organization and its needs have changed so much.
right.
I started with a very small founders board, as you call it, of three people who I knew very well and I trusted. And that was the right first step. Right now, one of those people is still on the board, and two others have moved on in very friendly way. I'm still in touch with them and still come to them to ask specific questions, with that they can advise on. But I think as an organization grows, it's really important to keep thinking about what does the board need and not sort of forget about it as you're busy with everything else. I think that's
Yeah.
part of the challenge, right? We always have so much to do. Our plates are so full, and naturally we're drawn towards running our programs, right? And then we need to fundraise, and then
Yeah.
well, the board kind of is what it is. But in my experience, it's not something that's going to reinvent itself or move forward with you without you as a founder sort of driving that momentum. And for me, I think that's looked a lot like always being actively on the lookout for great members to add onto the board,
Hmm.
never feeling like that's done. And also really communicating clearly about the vision and where we're going and what are the specific ways that people can support. So
Yeah.
if someone wants to grow along with us, they can do that. But then if it no longer feels like a fit, then it's very explicit, like here's what we're looking for, here's where we're going. And then we can sort of bless and release if that's no longer a good fit for a particular person. And at the same time, we're bringing new people on who are aligned with where we need to be. So it's sort of this very continuous natural growth and evolution of the board rather than seeing it as something that's set in stone. You build the board, you're done building the board, and
Yeah.
it's a one-time.
I want to like print that and put it on my desk. Bless and release. This is this is not unique to nonprofits, but that that statement stands out to me because in my experience as a founder, I started my own accounting firm and it's grown rapidly over 9.5 years. And one of the things that I had to accept pretty early on is that you have to make decisions and accept that you know it's going to serve for a period of time. And there's going to be a time where you have to make a different decision because the organization evolves and what you need, or what more specifically, what the organization needs, will also evolve. And I think I can't even imagine how difficult that would have been for you as a founder of a nonprofit, bringing on your first wave of board members, having to make the difficult decision that this organization is kind of growing, evolving. We need to add specific talent or specific, people or skills, experience, whatever it might be. And then also, I'm sure, although you don't have to go into details because, people listen to this, you're faced with realities where like this person doesn't, this organization is not what they're looking for anymore, or like the way that they want to serve doesn't make sense for us anymore. And you really have to navigate that very delicately. It's not only are you changing processes and systems and everything's changing about your organization, but the board governance is also changing. And I think that that's where I could see founders, especially if their initial board members were very close to them in their inner circle, that they can be kind of stuck and not being able to move or be as nimble as they want, because how do you delicately dance around that personal relationship? Also, they're volunteers and they've rallied and supported you initially, but like the organization is moving in a different direction. So I sympathize with that. You don't have to give specifics on that, but I think that's probably a thing that a lot of founders that might be listening can really relate to.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the key thing is for me has just been remembering like there's no bad guys. The vast
Mhm.
majority of the time, it's not that anyone is wrong or bad, and that makes this all a lot easier, right? It's just that I think any board service role is is a mutual and symbiotic relationship. What are they getting out of it? What are
Mhm.
they putting into it, right? What is the organization getting out of it? And it's just an equation that has to make sense. And if it no longer makes sense, it doesn't mean that someone failed. It just
Right.
means that it's not a fit. And, board roles are so different too across organizations. And we'll talk about this later. Like, what do board members actually do? Just because someone's not a fit for your organization today doesn't mean that, they weren't good at it 2 years ago, or that there's not another organization that needs exactly what they're looking for. And
Right.
again, communication comes in, right? Being very clear on what those needs are.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to, you had mentioned just kind of continuous recruitment or just always kind of keeping your eyes and ears open. How do you balance like the people you meet today with what the organization has or needs today versus where you're going, and like hiring for what you're going to need? So, not just looking at resumes, but really thoughtful recruiting. Like how do you navigate that? Because I'm sure that's on your mind as you've already lived through your, initial experience. You're like, okay, things can quickly change. So I need some individuals that maybe I can grow into, or as we scale, will continue to serve a really important role here that you won't quickly outgrow, for lack of a better word. What do you look at there? How do you balance that?
That's such a great question. I think it's definitely hard and I haven't perfected it, but
Mhm.
having a strategy that looks a few years ahead and
Yeah.
thinking about what you're trying to do as an organization.
Yeah.
I think we have our sort of our big long-term vision as well, which is very aspirational for 20 years. We have our annual plans, and then I try to also think in that, more in the middle, like a few years
Sure.
ahead, what are we going to be doing? And looking for the gaps based on what we've already got on the
Right.
board has been helpful. But I can't say that we've never had an experience where we have an urgent need now that
Yeah. Yeah.
we anticipate. And I mean that happens, so you have to be nimble. The good thing about a board versus filling a vacancy for an employee where you have one employee and you're trying to balance up these things
Right.
and one person that checks all your boxes. A board by definition, right, can be 5, 10, 15
Right.
people. So you have a lot more room for adding people who might be really good at one thing that's needed now, another thing that might be needed in the future, right? There's a lot of flexibility there to get people with different interests and skill sets. So it's less difficult, I think, than thinking about hiring for one particular role on a team.
Yeah, and I would imagine for some organizations that is more difficult than others because an organization like yours that's very tech heavy, virtual, like, the work that you're doing being in a remote space, I could or organizations like yours that rely very heavy on skills that are rapidly changing or evolving or trends are changing requires somebody that's really up to speed on some of these things in a different way than an organization that might be more mature in their growth and kind of geographically like centralized, or I can imagine that's different for every organization. But I empathize with that too, because that's definitely, as a founder with an organization that was rapidly growing, that processes, it felt like every 6 months we were re-engineering something. And sometimes your budget or your capacity allows for one thing, but if you hit your goals, your reality, capacity, financial resources, otherwise, time, money, energy might look differently in 6 to 12 months. So you can entertain something different. It's a really delicate dance. So that's why I asked that question. I've lived through that so many times and it's tricky.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing is just having advisors who are not on the board, who are coming
Mm,
on to specific initiatives. It's something I've done a lot, and often it doesn't turn into a board seat. Sometimes it has. So that's another option. If you know you need help with something now or will in the next 6 to 12 months, but you're not sure to what extent this is a long-term need,
yeah.
I think it's actually even easier, I think, than getting someone to come into the board because they're not making a long-term commitment. It feels less scary.
Mm.
There's not a contract that you sign or, a financial commitment that they make. People are very excited to share their knowledge. So I think for some of our needs that are more transient, we have just gotten informal advice. I have a whole
Oh, that's
bunch of
good.
people I can think of now that are helping with, XYZ specific topics that I know we won't need long term. And so I don't think of it as a board member.
Well, that's really smart. And I've shared that too in passive advice with some of my clients. I think that's a really good takeaway that just because you have a temporary need doesn't mean you need to convert that to a long-term board seat, right? And kind of being mindful of like, what is the need you have? How does it align with specific people? And maybe they're not really at a space or wanting to commit to a long-term board seat, or maybe it's an opportunity for you just to introduce them for a period or a season. And maybe it does ultimately, but I think that's really smart and strategic. So, shifting gears a little bit, this is a conversation I find myself having all of the time on what a board member should, or more importantly, shouldn't be doing, and striking the balance between engaged, involved, and completely overstepping. Um, from your experience, what do you think a board member should be doing or not doing? Where is the boundary here? Where should the healthy boundary?
I think part of the challenge, Tasha, is that there's not one right answer here, right? It depends
Mm,
on the organization. And that's why, again, I come back to communication is so important because someone may have served, on a board or even two or three boards and had one model that was healthy for that organization at that time. And then they
yeah.
come and try to do the same thing, for a new organization. Suddenly it's like, what are you're doing? You're overstepping. Why we don't need this. You're distracting us.
Yeah.
So I think there's, broadly several different kinds of boards, right? There's the working board where you're really expected to be hands-on in running the organization. Maybe there isn't staff, maybe the executive director is the sole staff member. And so really there, it's all about the time and the input. And you actually do want to be hands-on, own things and get them done.
Hmm.
On the flip side, there's a governance board of an organization that's mature, that has its funding sources more or less. And it's really oversight in terms of you make sure that the financials look fine, that the annual plan looks fine. You might do a little bit of, advice giving to tweak the plans. You're doing big strategic planning sessions every year or two about the overall direction, but things are pretty much going very well with a professional staff and you're just there to have that very light oversight to make sure everything is kosher and legal and again very high level strategic planning. And then in the middle, which is I suppose where we are with ENGin right now, it's you're kind of past the working board, so there is a paid staff and they're doing the actual work, but you're not mature yet, and you're building these funding sources and trying to figure out how are we going to sustainably fund this thing, and really that's probably the most important piece at that point is the contacts or financial support to build that fundraising base. And in situations like that, people who want to get very involved, hands-on, find
Mhm.
it frustrating because that gets in the way of the staff. And then people who want to be more high level with ideas also find it frustrating because there's not the funds to implement those ideas.
Right.
And usually there's already a long list of ideas that we're not doing before we figure out the funding. So I think, and I'm sure there's other sort of combinations of those, but that's three situations that I've seen personally. And I feel like communicating clearly what kind of board you are and which of those three you fall into is going to be key, because you're going to want a certain amount of time versus financial commitment, um, depending on where you're at with the organization.
It's funny kind of hearing you talk about this. I just kind of had this aha moment that those organizations are a little bit in the middle. It's sometimes by department. For example, the board might need to be more of oversight, not in the day-to-day operations, for example, on fundraising, because they've got an established team, pretty well-oiled process. Like, they've got that running up and running pretty well. There might be other areas that are not quite developed yet. Maybe on the accounting and finance side, for example, I see this a lot because if their funding structures have changed quite a bit or their need for technology and integration is not quite there. Rather than finding myself, I'm speaking from my own experience right now, where we're a working board versus an oversight board. And then sometimes you get in as a board member, you're like, this doesn't quite feel like what maybe I thought. Well, when they say working board, they actually mean working board. There's usually a little confusion there. It's really when it's like we want an oversight board, we don't want a board involved in the day to day. But there are oftentimes elements where, they bring you in for your expertise for a certain for a reason, right? But you find yourself having very tactical day to day conversations, at least I have, specifically on how should we create this invoicing procedure? How should we do this? How should we do that? And I myself, as a board member, have been stuck because it's like, I don't want to overstep and make you all think you have to do it this way because this is just a suggestion or an idea. But then I also recognize based on my role as a board member, does that come as like an authoritative like voice? And striking that balance between I want to be helpful, but I don't want to feel like I overstep. But it's got me thinking that some of the organizations that I work with, not necessarily clients, but in a volunteer capacity, that I think there's departments. Like it's not just the organization is either this or that. It's almost like, we need to drill down almost to another layer where there's probably segments of the organization that is mature and in a space where it's oversight. Usually I would guess first would be programmatic, right? We got this. Maybe then even fundraising potentially. Obviously, we always need the board to bring people to the table, but the day-to-day tactical stuff of fundraising is probably something that can be absorbed internally. And then last but not least, maybe some of the infrastructure stuff. Think like IT or accounting or legal or HR, some of those other things that are more specialized skills that I know we tend to lean on boards for. Anyway, I think that's interesting that it's individualized and it depends. And I think having that conversation at a board, and I'll put you on the spot a little bit, like who initiates that conversation? Who should initiate that conversation? Because I think as a person running the organization, especially a founder, you have a good
Mhm.
like you have a good grasp on like what you feel like you have under control and what you don't need a lot of meddling and what you do need help with. But sometimes I think board presidents come in and like I'm in charge. I'm the board president. In a perfect world, it would be an initial like collective conversation, but I think to start a healthy, productive relationship from the get-go as board members are joining, I don't know. I'm just thinking who should prompt that conversation of like, let's break this down, like where we really need your support, where and how what that looks like. Maybe even by committee or function of the board. For example, treasurer needs to look like something a little bit differently than the president or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, it would be a kind of an equal collaboration between the board chair and the executive director. And I think, again, that's very rare, coming back to the myths we were talking about. So usually one side is driving it more. I do think,
Hmm.
especially if you're the founder, it does make more sense to be driving it. Just because you know it more. I mean, one thing I appreciate about my board is that they're not shy about pushing back or against my ideas or introducing alternative perspectives or sort of catching me if I'm missing something. So I
Mhm.
think that's really good and that's really healthy. I wouldn't want to be driving these processes and getting no pushback and feel like everyone's just rubber stamping everything.
Right.
But I do think that, I do tend to end up initiating more. And I think that's most common. And I think it's better than the alternative of a board president really micromanaging, or really anyone on the board
Right.
micromanaging and saying, well, you feel good about this, the results are there, but actually I want to do it differently and I want to redo it. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah, but I mean, ideally, right, it would be an equal collaboration. So that's something I think we can all strive to.
Yeah, in my experience working with, a couple hundred organizations every month, it feels like it's one extreme or the other, like really overly engaged,
Yes.
micromanaging board members. And usually it's just members, it's not the collective board, especially when they're in specific positions that serve on specific committees or oversight in certain capacities. Or I think it's an entirely disengaged board where the CEOs are just very frustrated and need support. And it might just be people are just disengaged and are not a good fit at that season of life to serve on that board. But I think sometimes it's also they just don't know where or how to best
Yeah.
support. And it's really hard because the executive directors have like a full job of running the organization, and then they also have like a full job of coordinating, collaborating, and like organizing the board too. So
Yeah,
it's a tricky thing.
absolutely. And we need to find time for that too. When we plan our year, our month, our week, I think I used to just not count that as a responsibility as part of my job, but it
Mm,
absolutely is. So now I know a certain number of hours a week will be board related things. And I want to come back to something you said about people wanting to share their skills but kind of feeling frustrated. I think most people that I've seen that they want to join a board, it's because they want to give advice and share their knowledge.
mm,
And that makes you feel good, right? To sort of be an expert and to take skills that you have already and use them in the service of a mission that you're really passionate about. And the problem happens when the organization doesn't actually need advice in that area, and it's mutually frustrating. And I see this happen over and over and over in so many different nonprofit contexts. And so that's something that I think is one of the keys to my success, relative success of building a board, is trying to be really upfront now about where do I actually have questions and have problems that I want
yeah.
to come to someone to, and where there just aren't any ways for someone to plug in. Like I had a really, really smart guy who reached out to me whose expertise was building programs, and he really wanted to use his incredible corporate knowledge to help build new programs, but that's not where we are at all. And
Right.
so there's really nothing for him to do, and it was really frustrating. And I think to me, going through that was really valuable because now I have the awkward conversations at the beginning. I talk about what we
Yeah.
need, and I don't just assume if you want to join a board, you'll do what needs to be done. I say where we're at and where we need help, and it's not super smooth sailing. I mean, sometimes people are still frustrated, disappointed because they feel like they're being turned away and they're so passionate. But
Yeah.
it's better to have that conversation at the beginning than sit there and be frustrated for months or years because they're trying to do something that's not needed,
Mm.
and you're butting heads.
You remind me of a conversation I had earlier this week, that I was on a call with some team members, some staff on a board that I serve. And I have found, okay, so I've had a couple conversations, and usually there's no like structures, like we need help with some just like things, okay, very broad topic. And the first conversation was just kind of the wild, wild west. There was like no structure. We didn't really know. There was a few of us board members on there that have specific backgrounds. We didn't really know what we were there for. And the staff, I don't know if they totally understood what we were there for. I mean, we had a general idea of what the topic was, but I found a lot of the conversation, us just, talking head experts on the board, just sharing our random opinions, thoughts, ideas, and experiences. And towards the end of the conversation, I had this moment of like, and I asked the staff, like, is this helpful? Like,
Mhm.
um, And so we had already had on the books for 2 weeks later to have a continuation of just like how do we improve kind of our infrastructure and how we operate. But it was a semi-different topic. And before we even started, I had asked, what do you all specifically want to talk about? Like, what do you need our advice on? So that we are not just sitting here giving you a bunch of information that you don't need, that is not useful to you, and frankly, just wasting everybody's time. And I'm going to be more thoughtful going forward because that shift on just before we even start this conversation, what do you need from me, or what would be the best use of like what could I offer that would solve your most immediate problems? um, really shifted the conversation and structured it in a much more, I think, productive way. And I think that the team left feeling some support and resources rather than just like, okay, you've just given me a bunch more information that wasn't really useful, and now I still have the same problems I have to go out and solve. And so I think that question could be asked by, or I guess that spirit could be addressed on both sides. Like if you're a team member, if you're listening to this podcast and you're somebody that's dealing with a board, being very clear about, I really wanted your support for these specific things, and trying to target their experience and channeling that towards the things that you're trying to get advice on, to keep you going from all these tangents of stuff you don't want to hear about. But then also as a board member, if you're a board member listening to this, asking the question, like, what do they need help with? Because that was definitely an eye-opening moment for me this week, and I felt like the conversation was way more meaningful for all people. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, at least in my own experience this week, in fact.
Yeah, I love that. I wish more board members stopped to ask that question. I don't think I've ever heard that. And, it's not intuitive. Like, I don't think I would ask that if I were a board member either. So I totally don't blame anyone. But I think this is such a good takeaway for those who serve on boards to say, can we ask the questions first to get um the full understanding of the problem, and on the flip side, as nonprofit staff, we need to do a better job of framing the challenges we're facing. And I've
Yeah.
definitely made mistakes here and try to be better at it, because I might say something like, oh, we're struggling with volunteer recruitment, right? And immediately they'll go, oh, have you tried A, B, C, or D? And well, I've tried A and B, and for some reasons C and D are not actionable right now. So then they feel like their advice is kind of not being listened to, but
Right.
actually, that's not, I didn't communicate the context of the problem. Whereas I should have said, hey, we're struggling with volunteer recruitment. We've done these things. We've already considered these, but for these reasons, they're just not practical right now.
Yeah.
No budget
What else do you
capacity,
have?
whatnot. What else, right? What else do you have, right? So
Mhm.
yes, I try to do that more, but again, this is something that can come from both sides, right? We
Yeah.
we should, and board members should ask.
Yeah, and I think, if I was an employee still working and presenting and dealing with boards, I feel like me being very specific on what I'm framing would allow the conversations to not go completely down rabbit holes. I mean, I've participated in so many board meetings where it's really just a reporting out of like these are the things we've done. And I think boards feel like they have to, for their oversight in government or governance rather, like poke and prod and just like push a little bit
Yes.
just to like do a little bit of a temperature check because I think that's their role. Which, I mean, there is a place for that, but also we've spent the entire board meeting now talking in circles with no actual like value add for anybody. And then like I said, I think everybody kind of walks away kind of frustrated and unheard.
Yes.
So I have a few other things I want to get through because I have so many different thoughts, ideas, challenges through board. So let me try to fly through those. So I definitely see this also a shift as organizations go from like smaller organizations or founder boards to something bigger. And there's this idea, I think, of chasing these prestigious board members. So, how can nonprofit leaders shift from, maybe if that's their direction, from pursuing prestigious board members, high net wealth individuals, well connected individuals, whatever it might be, and how you define that, to the right people for their board that may not come with the obvious benefits of money and connections. I see this sometimes a bit of a struggle, or I've seen leaders feel like they have to shift in that direction. What would you say to those folks?
Well, I would question why it has to be an either or.
Mm,
I think, again, the board is not one person, so you can have a mix of individuals. And I think you always need to start with where you are as an organization, what your plan is, and if you have a 5-year plan, a 3-year plan, whatever it is, and what's missing to get there. So I might say something like, well, as we grow, there's more legal questions, and I feel like I'm in shakier ground
Hmm.
answering those correctly and handling those correctly. Maybe, accounting and finance has gotten more complex. I need to build more systems and automate it more so I could use advice there. And I really need someone who's strong overseeing our more complex financial statements. Also, I, have a need for money, and the fundraising sources I have now, they're
Yeah.
not meeting increased needs, and I'm not quite sure where to go next. So I need someone who is going to be able to contribute, or someone who has the networks to connect us to potential grant makers. And so those are all of my needs. And so I have people for each need. And when I'm talking to potential board members, I figure out which of these gaps they could fill, and that's what they're there for. And I'm very clear with them about here's what the needs are, what makes sense for you, and then if it's none, then then it's not a fit at this time. But I think it's key to be open to having a board that's a mix of people who are there with very specific professional skills, and people who are there primarily for connections, and people who are there writing checks. And then the ideal, of course, is when you have more than one. So, I have a board member who's an incredibly generous donor and also has such a wonderful experience in the nonprofit sector in terms of giving me advice on fundraising and communicating with donors and things like that. So I just feel incredibly lucky to have someone that can sort of check both of those very important boxes for me
Yeah.
at the same time, right? And that's I think that's not a requirement, but it's sort of a benefit that yeah that I'm lucky to have it in a few different board members where they can kind of bring
Mhm.
more than one thing out at once. But I think everyone should be filling one previously identified need. What I used to do a lot before that I don't do now is just meeting someone who's really smart, really passionate about the program, maybe even someone I already trust because they volunteered with us for some time. So I know them. And they say, oh, I would love to join your board. And I say, yeah, sure, without
Mhm.
understanding, well, what is the need that I've already identified that then they're going to fill?
Yeah.
So that really works well. And I think it's a matter of taking the time to figure out what your needs are more broadly, all right, financially and otherwise, and have a mix of people and really create that culture, be very explicit with the board, because I know there can be a concern, well, why are they donating much more, than me, or why am I donating much more than them? Why isn't all the same? But a big part of running a board, right, is acknowledging people's contributions, and I think it's important people give us their time and money, right? And we want to do it for gratitude, but also it builds a culture of like, well, here's the valuable contribution this person brings in, here's the valuable contribution this person brings in, and one can be skills, and one could be connections, and one could be money. And frankly, if someone's not adding a lot of value, with their skills, because you don't need it all that much, well, then they shouldn't have been on the board. Maybe that's that like one-off advisor or occasional
Yeah.
advisor. But if you're focusing your key needs, I think it's very balanced, and you just get the people to fill those needs.
You bring up an interesting point. That I've kind of had a bit of an observation for those organizations that are a little bit in the middle of the road, right? Where they're kind of shifting a little bit from a working board to more of an oversight board. And by oversight board, sometimes I see, many times I see that coupled with trying to go after individuals that can bring some more financial resources to the organization, right? Because the bigger you get, then you want to have your own internal team, like paid employees to do the things. So you don't need the board to do as many working tasks as before, but you need money to pay those employees, right? So that seems like a natural, like, evolution that happens there. And I think I like your approach of mixing both while you're, especially when you're in that middle space, of like a working board with those that bring other, like I said, financial contributions, connections, whatever it might be. Because I've had a conversation recently with an executive director that wants to move to an oversight board, and they want to go after these really uh, busy, established high net worth individuals that may own multiple businesses, involved in many boards, and they're not interested in being on a working board because they don't have the capacity to be on a working board. And I suggested to the CEO, I said, the problem is you want these individuals that are going to bring this particular connection, the financial, like the oversight, and they serve on all these different boards, but you also want them to be on a working board. Like I think you're gonna find that's gonna be in contradiction. Like it's going to be really rare to find the person that will be able to do both, right? And so I think especially when you're in that middle space, I think you're smart in mixing and understanding what does this person bring, what are the expectations for them, and how do they bring value to the organization, and is not going to look the same for all of the different people because what the organization needs are very specific things, and what each individual person does fills a gap somewhere, but it doesn't look the same across the board. So,
Yes, yes. I think it has to be individualized. And I think we fall into this trap of like, well, we have a board document that says what the requirements are. Like at ENGin, we actually don't have a single give get because we know that it's different for everyone. And,
mm,
someone may be there because they're filling a key role that is not related to bringing in funding. And
yeah.
that's fine. It's very individualized and that takes more time. But like I said earlier, like I now invest that time more to the extent I can. I think I need to allocate even more time to do it better. But yeah, having individualized relationships with every board member and figuring out how they're plugging in, if they're being successful, setting them up for success, rather than having this blanket rule that is probably going to leave most board members feeling like they're not quite what you need.
Right.
It's worth the time.
So can I leave with one last question? Maybe it's a little bit of advice. Maybe it's a little just like painting a picture. What does a healthy, high functioning board look like? You said you spend a lot of your time investing in the relationship building and just kind of keeping the board at high functioning. Kind of in your world, what does that look like? Because I feel like this is almost like a statement or a question, like it's an aspiration of like, my family is dysfunctional and I want like a healthy family. It's like I have a dysfunctional board. I want a healthy board. But does anybody really know what that means? Like, I'm just curious from your perspective and all the time, energy, and attention that you've put into this. What does that look like for you? Or how would you describe that to somebody that maybe feels like they're not there or aspires, but they don't know what that looks like?
I think enthusiasm and commitment is one key piece, and it really feeds off each other, right? People feed off each other when people show up to meetings and they have ideas and positive feedback and they're excited about the organization.
Mhm.
That encourages other board members to do that. So it's a virtuous cycle. And so
Yeah.
having people be enthusiastic and energetic, and frankly, people like each other, taking the time to socialize and build relationships, and that all creates this positive culture and climate. And that's something that I think is very much in our control in creating those opportunities for people to get to know each other and sharing inspiring stories before you get to the numbers and the
Mhm.
details of like why are we all doing this, right? To get people excited, to motivate them. I think that the second key piece is agreement over where the organization is going,
Mhm.
both the mission and vision and sort of the big picture, but also like what's our plan for 2025? What are we trying to do? What's the organization going to accomplish? And understanding that since it's a bigger group, there's going to be disagreement and you have to work as a team, and sort of we have to let go of our pet ideas. There needs to be a certain tolerance of understanding that it won't come out exactly as you like. So your job is to share your perspectives, maybe question alternative perspectives, try to find gaps in it. But the end result isn't to convince everyone to do things your way, but
Mhm.
it's to come up with, a final solution is probably going to have little pieces from multiple different perspectives. And then sometimes your perspective just isn't the one that's going to work, right?
Mhm.
And you're going to let it go and you're going to get behind what the organization has decided and what the group has decided. So I think that's key. And I think, as CEOs, we have to do that too. We don't want a yes board, as you were saying
Yeah.
before. We want to understand that sometimes people are going to bring in ideas that we haven't thought of or don't sound good to us. And then we talk through it with the group and it's like, hey, this is actually the right thing to do. And being open to that on all sides, I think is really, really key. And liking each other, and having that enthusiasm really helps with that. Yeah, and I think, having the financial support, frankly, I do think a board that isn't excited about fundraising and contributing, it can't really be a healthy board for a nonprofit because it's just such a key part of the model. So I'm super happy and grateful that we have, 100% board participation. We have multiple significant donors among our board, and I can't overstate how motivating that is for me, knowing that I'm not by myself, that other people care enough and believe enough in my organization to put their money behind it. I do think that helps a lot with the board culture. But it's just one of the key pieces, I think.
I love that. Thank you for sharing all of that. And I want to give a shout out to your organization that, like I said, you're the founder and you've been able to build this. If people wanted to follow along with the work that you're doing, watching your journey of growth and see some of the history of where you've been able to grow, what is the best way to kind of get in touch or to follow along? Should I send people to your website or LinkedIn? How can people get connected to hear more about the work that you've been building and follow along with your story?
Yeah, we've been building a pretty revolutionary nonprofit. We always love sharing what we've learned, and we have wonderful volunteer opportunities too for anyone who speaks English and is interested in making connections across borders. So, would love for people to check us out at enginprogram.org. So that's ENGIN
Mhm.
program.org, and you can learn all about our online connection program there. It's pretty unique and out of the box. So
Yeah.
I encourage you all to check it out.
And for those that are listening, can you give us a really quick, shameless plug for what your organization does and why you started it?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank
Well,
you
why
for
not?
asking.
Because it's actually really interesting, and I love the concept of it. So, for those that won't hop over to hear or to the website, and they just want to hear about what you're doing and the type of people we have on this podcast, I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so basically, we're connecting people in Ukraine who are learning English with English speaking volunteers worldwide for weekly online conversations.
Mm,
And it's sort of like pen pals on Zoom, but turbocharged because they're meeting every week. They're building really strong relationships. There's a big cultural exchange component. There's an opportunity for the Ukrainians to improve their English, which opens up all kinds of opportunities in terms of, academic and professional options. And the idea is that we're doing this at unprecedented scale. So we're connecting people in a very, very individual, one-on-one way. They build these connections. And then one day we hope to reach 1 million people, million
mm.
connections, and actually transform an entire country through the power of one-on-one connection to drive social and economic growth. So that's a big vision. We've reached 55,000 people so far,
It's
and
incredible.
we're just getting started. So hopefully lots more good things to come.
I love the concept of what you're doing, and I can imagine as a founder the demand for the work, not just on those in Ukraine and connecting them with English speaking, but this is obviously could be such a much bigger across every border, every language, right? In a space that feels like people want to be connected, and to create a virtual space for that, and to be able to cross borders and learn language and share information and culture and things like that, while your focus is on English speaking individuals with those in Ukraine. Like, I'm sure people ask you all the time, like, Katerina, are you going to expand beyond that? You're like,
Yes,
one country at a time, y'all.
yeah, it's like kind of like that. What we want to do is create a replicable template that other
Mm,
countries can look and say, well, hey, we want to, invest in our human capital and we want to get the benefits of social and economic growth in a very low cost way. How can we do this? And then we would be happy to facilitate that. So that's the idea, to sort of create a case study, because this has never really been done
right.
before, right? If you invest in your human capital, usually it's like very formal, structured, expensive education programs, or you pick a few of the best people and you send them to study abroad and you bring them back, right? All of this has been done, but the idea of connecting 1 million people in your country informally, one-on-one, across borders, to learn new skills, to get a global perspective, to build relationships, that's never been done before. So I do think in order for this to work, we really need to show the sort of the
Proof of
success in
concept. Yeah.
Ukraine and have that. And then, yes, and then it can go to other countries. We don't want to stretch ourselves thin because if we don't build a critical mass and we just help a few people here, a few people there, the concept doesn't really work. So that's my answer. But yes, one day look for us everywhere.
I love that. And I love, like I said, meeting other founders like you. That's really why we started this podcast a few years ago, because I love finding either founders or those that work with founders or other organizations that, I call us even at one point like young, scrappy organizations. And coupling those with resources or giving them stories of inspiration on how they can still have a really powerful impact. They can really grow their programs. They can really get the word out, but in a very high impact, low cost because, we just don't have a lot of money, limited resource environment. So I always love sharing stories about yours. And I know we didn't get into specifics about what you do, but it's really kind of a revolutionary thing. And it looks like it's having a tremendous impact already. And just sharing your insights on just board and seeing how much you've grown, changed, and evolved, and your experiences navigating the board dynamic, I'm sure was not an easy thing. But like I said, I'll thank you again for sharing that with the audience here. Before we go, though, I do this every time. If you all found this conversation interesting or informative in some way, you know how the digital world works. Engage with it in some way, share it with a friend, send it to a board member, like, subscribe, whatever it is, because it allows conversations like this to be found by other nonprofit leaders struggling with a lot of the same issues, right? I don't make up the rules. That's just how Meta works. So engage with it in some ways so that we can share this conversation with others. And until then, we'll see you next time. Bye.